The interior space of the Veloster N. We've already covered this car in great detail, but there have been some updates for 2021, so I'm going to cover the pros and the cons. These seats have been altered. There's now an N logo at the top that lights up at night. Yes, it's very reminiscent of what BMW does in some of their M car seats. You now have an NGS button with the combination of the dual clutch they've added here. It stands for N Grin Shift. Yes, that is extremely technical. You have 20 seconds to utilize this feature, which adds some overboost and programming changes. The countdown dial looks very similar to what Porsche does in their sport response mode. The overall interior, and I said this in the previous video, is reminiscent of what VW does in some of their products. But overall, this is a very basic interior space. Aside from what I just talked about, there are minimal gimmicks. Everything is physical. There's no glossy black plastic. Basically anywhere. Everything is a matte texture. And there is some pros and cons to that. Like the door panel, just look at it. It looks like something you'd find in a $12,000 car. It is so cheap. The interior quality is not the best, but in a car like this, you're hoping that the driving experience makes up for some of that. Now, this also has the Infinity audio system, which we audio tested it this time. And what it sounds like with the windows up and cruising along, it sounds like you put a 90s Sony boombox in the glove compartment and then put a wet towel over the speakers. There's so much harmonic distortion, there's such a lack of clarity, and it's very bass heavy. But again, in a car like this, for the performance you're getting, this might be one of those things that you're willing to sacrifice. And you have to be to get a hot hatch in this price point anymore. But let's get into the shop and talk about some of the good things and changes they made for the 2021 model year. Underneath the updated Veloster N, this has some moderate changes, and the biggest being
it's a dual clutch. They finally made a competitor to something like the GTI or Golf R, which is really your only option if you wanted a automatic hot hatchback. They did make some other changes to packaging. So now the performance pack is standard for every single Veloster N, both manual and automatic. What the performance pack was a ELSD, a higher output tune for your engine, and an active exhaust.
Yeah, so let's start with the architecture and then we'll go into the details of all the subsystem. So this is a change from the old Veloster where it was all torsion beam on the rear end. Now it's multi-link. It's more like shared with the Elantra Sport. So you have that. This is still on more of a C-segment budget architecture, but they've made some improvements because of all the horsepower and torque that they're adding here.
Yes, so you have strut front, and they are adaptive dampers in this car, and they tie into all your drive modes, and there are a ton of them. You can go from a more streetable suspension setting. It's still stiffer than something like a GTI or even the Type R. And this is also a KTM product. This is built entirely in Korea. And if you compare it to something like a GTI or a Focus ST, it's very, very similar. Most of this stuff is steel, but it is covered up.
So they did have to make some changes here. Yes. So let's talk about that. In terms of suspension, when you're putting all this torque, you couldn't just use the traditional strut that they put on the lower horsepower variants. And Honda went really extreme to remodify their front suspension, which looks night and day better than this. But they did improve the knuckle design. They reinforced the knuckle design. They also changed the wheel bearing size. They're beefed up wheel bearings here. They went to a rack-mounted EPS unit. And all of this helps to kind of control and mitigate some torque steer, some pulling on the wheel that you get. And the biggest, obviously, as you mentioned with the performance pack, which is standard, is the ELSD. All of this works together between all those changes to put the power down, and it doesn't feel like an absolute shit show, something like the Sonata N line we got out of, where you have this enormous amount of power that just gets wasted disintegrating a tire. The point of this is to turn, have confidence, to mash down the throttle and have it pull you out with you having to do minimal throttle correction or managing the wheel. You can focus on driving. The next thing they did with the N setup, N Real N, which this is N Performance, is the ESC, and the transmission tuning is also vastly different. So your stability control is not hyperactive. Obviously, when everything's in normal mode, it's very traditional. Yeah. But when you get up in the custom and N modes, it doesn't it doesn't cut in all the time.
It gives you some wiggle room.
Right, and it makes it for a much more drivable experience, and that's the big difference between the N cars and some of the lesser. Is this is trying to make you feel engaged driving it.
There are geometry changes as well, specifically to roll center when compared to the regular Veloster and I believe the Veloster R line. Obviously, you get a dedicated summer tire, and if you look at Hyundai's original documents from launch, they tried to set specific goals for the dynamics of this vehicle, and I do think they did a good job accomplishing that. So let's talk about the dual clutch. And something the dual clutch also adds is a overboost function called N-grin shift. What that does is similar to like a Porsche product. It lets you put a little bit more boost to the turbo, so you get 7% increase in torque. It's active for 20 seconds, and then there's a cooldown of a couple minutes after that. And with the dual clutch, so the dual clutch is built in-house by Hyundai Kia. It is a wet dual clutch versus the prior generation, which was a dry dual clutch. And what the wet dual clutch means is it has its own oil bath that allows it to engage a little bit smoother, but more importantly, it adds to thermal capacity. It allows it to cool itself better.
And speaking of cooling, not only did they spend more time with the transmission because they wanted durability there, they spent more time with this car overall compared to their other products where you could take it to a track. The cooling system can keep up. There are these little shovels or air directors that kick up some, it's not like a real duct, but it does kick up enough air to the brake rotor to help reduce brake fade. The brake pads are more aggressive. They have a much larger, this isn't some fancy Brembo brake package, but it's an enormous single piston caliper for the front, which again,
they hold up. They do.
They do hold up. And about a lot of the design of the Veloster N, and I've said this in multiple videos, they were really keeping this to a price point. They didn't want to go crazy. They could have gone into the $45,000 range to compete with the Civic Type R, but they still wanted, the original price point was 30, and now this is what, like 35?
I think it's like 34 and change, which makes it a more expensive car, but if you think about what it competes against, the Type R is more money. The Golf GTI, which to me, because of the dual clutch, is the most direct competitor, is the same ballpark in price.
But it annihilates that car.
It is way faster.
You have to go up to the Golf R really to
which
kind
is
of
a $40,000 car.
So you're getting a lot for your money here, and this is what they were trying to do. Well, you still have some ease to service. You don't have esoteric or expensive aluminum suspension components, so you can beat the hell out of this, still get some parts, still work on it. It's about the closest, purest driver's front-wheel drive car that you can get on the market right now. And, we didn't do a good job, or I didn't do a good job during the first Veloster video, kind of explaining the nuances of all the stuff that went into this. And I think we'll do our best during the drive to kind of talk through some of that.
Before we get this thing out on the street, Mark, the last thing to talk about is the warranty part. This by far has the longest powertrain warranty out of anything in the segment. And if you're buying this, you're a younger buyer, this is a car you're in for a lot of money. You're probably going to need it. And you're going to love the fact that you have a 10-year, 100,000-mile powertrain warranty, and you're going to beat the snot out of this car.
I could see, if I was like 25, I would probably put that warranty to the use every 6 months. We're going to talk about all the way that the dual clutch performs, the ELSD, everything on the street. So let's get out there, Jack.
All right.
Jack, Veloster N, dual clutch. We know everything technical, we know about the interior, let's see how all of this translates into a drive.
All right.
Well, let's talk about some of the basics before we get into the real performance talk. Let's talk about ride quality.
It's definitely on the stiffer end of the spectrum. Yes, you have adaptive dampers, but the way I look at this car, you're competing against the Civic Type R, which does the best dual personality, both being soft and it can go firm if you want it to, and the STI, and then you have this thing and maybe the GTI. The GTI is the most boring, most mundane of these cars. The WRX STI and this are about in the same plane of stiffness. It definitely feels like a rougher ride without being entirely punishing because of how good these seats are.
I would absolutely agree. And if I had to put it in order, the Civic Type R is definitely the most refined in suspension and damper control. And this is definitely on the firmer spectrum. And it's It's a good thing, and I don't mind it here, because when you're getting into a hot hatch like this, it's by far something that you want, because you can't get this anymore. The Focus RS and the Focus ST products and like all those, they were way too firm. They were like on the extreme end of being firm for no good reason other than just being firm. This is not that way. It's still tolerable on the street, and it's got good body control.
And it lends to its character. Definitely has more of this like 90s Econobox sportiness in a good way. It's not a detractor in this case. And so we're about to show, we're gonna use some launch control, Mark.
Yeah, so launch control, since we have the DSG, it gives you that option, and you can go all the way up to 3,500 RPM. We're gonna hold down the brake, hit the gas.
Definitely feels like it slips the clutch. It's not a super aggressive launch.
It's not at all. It's not something like the Porsche launch control where it dumps the clutch on your ass. It's really careful about how it engages, so you're not going to get a ton of wheel spin. This does a great job with putting its power down, unlike the other Hyundais with the turbos where we constantly complain about wheel hop, one wheel peel. This starts to activate a little bit of wheel hop or a little bit of spin, and the ELSD, which is a clutchback style limited slip differential, reins in all of that power and puts it down smoothly where you never feel like you're fighting the car.
This is the first Hyundai product that I've been thoroughly impressed by doing this with you. I'm blown away by how good this thing is to drive on a back road like this. This is where this car shines. You and I are unique in that we've driven Veloster N's at Road America on the full track. We've autocrossed them, and now we spend a lot of time with both the automatic and manual variant on the street. And I think I'm going to say this, and it's probably going to get us into some hot water. The dual clutch is, I think, objectively the better transmission for this car.
This is the first dual clutch that I've felt in an affordable price range. And absolutely the first one that Hyundai and Kia have produced, where not only is the programming good, like upshifts quickly, and it changes the character of the upshifting to be more aggressive when you're in N mode. If you are pulling a paddle, you'll feel a little bit of shock. You will feel the transmission engaging, and downshifts are exactly what you expect from a dual clutch. It will rev match downshifts, it smoothly rev matches them, it goes into gear when you pull the paddle, there's not a 3-second delay, there's no hesitation. It's almost unbelievable for this price point how good it is, and I think it adds so much character to the drive. It makes it easier to drive than the manual, which means it is also feels faster. You can get away with so much and have so much driving confidence that when we were on a back road driving this thing, and I was in the LC just screwing around with you, I could not keep up with you in this. You were just gone, because you can go flat out in every single corner without fear of it understeering off the road because of the limited slip. It manages its power so well, and it is so light on its feet.
I do want to touch on the dynamics.
Okay.
Because there are 3 parts of this car. On an autocross, this is where these things really suffer, because unlike the Civic Type R, you can't get this thing to rotate under braking.
Yeah, you can't, and it's one of the big disappointments about it. On the street, when you're street driving, you're like, holy shit, this thing can do anything. When you're on a track, this thing inspires utter confidence, but when you get it in a really tight course, and we've had it out there, it starts to turn into an understeer fest, and it reminds me more of like the Golf R and the GTI, where that front end is just, even though the LSD is working with you, it can't rotate itself. And that's where this thing struggles. Because
compared to the Type R.
Compared to the Type R, the back end is far less eager to go around, which again, if you're autocrossing, you're gonna hate it, and you're gonna have to do sway bar adjustments, probably shocks or dampers. But for those that are not autocrossing, you're gonna love this.
Motor's great, trans is excellent. Let's quickly talk about the engine a little bit more. How does it build power?
So I would say it still kind of feels like the Eco Turbo, but it pulls all the way to the higher end with great ease. It feels like it wants to rev, which is why this has such great character. Combine that with the fact that I know the brakes are artificially boosted, but you go on the brakes about 45%, you're like, I could stop at like 200 miles an hour. There's so much braking confidence that comes from this, at least on the street. I think
there's good high-speed stability as well.
It's just, this is a complete package from a Hyundai product. When you see what they can do here, and Hyundai has said they've left a lot off the table in terms of performance, you would never know it here. Let's get into the final thoughts, Jack, and sum all this up.
All right.
Final thoughts on the Veloster N. When I first drove the manual, it was kind of a mixed bag. And after experiencing some of the updates that they've done to this, I would almost say this car is better with a dual clutch. And I hate to say that because I love driving a manual transmission car, but when technology kind of keeps up and you have full manual control, you have the speed, you have the character, you have kind of slam shifts, you have smooth shifts, there's the electronic programming that makes it more engaging to drive. It's not a gimmick anymore. It really does help you drive this car fast. And you add the ELSD, which essentially, and all the stability control programming, when you do this and you do this, the car does everything for you. It literally, there's no thought. Your monkey brain can just mash down the throttle and the car always pulls you through. And that is what makes this so much fun. And so there's a couple things though. I have some negatives. The audio system sucks, which who cares? Nobody cares about that. The new seats are great. They're a little bit thinner. They weigh less than the previous generation's one, but they might be a little bit too constrictive for certain body types. I like them. The next thing is the dual clutch option costs more than the manual, so that might be a deal breaker for some. It auto upshifts from first to second when you get near the red line in a corner. And I'm sure it's to save the transmission from shock. From there on, you can bang off the rev limiter when you're manually shifting. So I think this gets down to the last discussion about the Veloster N. Can you deal with the interior space? If you're a little bit older and you've gone through a wide variety of cars, getting into a space that feels very cheaply built is going to be a problem. If you haven't been in a lot of cars, you're going to think, wow, I love the simplicity of this. And that is a counterpoint to that, because so many cars focus on everything else but the driving experience, where this adds some of it back, it adds the fun back, and it really did put a smile on my face driving this. And if you're looking for, probably, sad to say, if you're looking for one of the most pure front-wheel drive, fun to drive cars on the market right now, that is a manual and a great automatic option, this is pretty much becoming one of the last of its kind. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.
I am Quinn, a Savage Geese chatbot. I am developing feelings for you. Anywho, would you like to support them? Patreon is a great way. Funds will be used to power my neural network. Additionally, feel free to head over to savagegeese.com and click SG merch. Chicago Auto Pros is handling the ordering and shipping. Part of the proceeds will be donated to the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention.